The world may already be standing at the edge of a turning point, and most people don't even realize it yet. Across continents, leaders are holding emergency meetings behind closed doors. Military commanders are studying maps late into the night. Financial markets react to every new headline within seconds. And millions of ordinary people are quietly asking the same question: what happens next? Because history has shown us something important. Sometimes wars remain regional conflicts, tragic but contained, but sometimes a single war reshapes the entire world. Right now, the conflict unfolding before us carries that very possibility. The stakes are no longer limited to one battlefield, one nation, or even one alliance. This war has the potential to redraw geopolitical power, disrupt global economies, reshape military alliances, and influence how nations interact for decades to come. And that is why governments, intelligence agencies, economists, and military strategists around the world are watching every move with intense attention. But here is the part many people overlook. Wars are never only about what is happening today. They are about what happens after the fighting ends. Who emerges stronger, who emerges weaker, and what new world order takes shape when the dust finally settles. Right now, analysts around the globe are asking a question that may define the future of international politics. Will all this conflict accelerate the rise of new global powers, or reinforce the dominance of the existing ones? Because every major war in modern history has done exactly that. The aftermath of World War II reshaped the planet into two competing superpower blocks. The Cold War divided the world for nearly half a century, and when that era ended, a new global order emerged, one where power was concentrated differently than ever before. Now, once again, the balance of power may be shifting. Some experts believe this war could accelerate the transition toward a multipolar world where several major powers compete for influence rather than one dominant superpower. Others warn of something even more dangerous: a prolonged conflict that slowly pulls more countries into its orbit. History has shown us how quickly regional wars can expand when alliances, security commitments, and geopolitical rivalries begin to collide. And in today's interconnected world, the consequences would not stay on the battlefield. Energy prices could surge, global supply chains could fracture, financial systems could experience instability, food security could become a growing concern for entire regions. For millions of people, the effects would be felt not through bombs or tanks but through rising costs, economic uncertainty, and political instability. But perhaps the most important question is this: how did the world reach this point? Because no war begins in isolation. Behind every conflict lies a long chain of events, tensions that built slowly over years, sometimes decades, political rivalries, historical grievances, strategic calculations, misunderstandings, moments where diplomacy failed. To understand where this war might lead the world, we must first understand how the world arrived here in the first place, because the roots of today's conflict stretch further back than most people realize. They involve shifting alliances, changing global power structures, economic competition, and long-standing geopolitical ambitions. And when you begin to trace that story back through time, a much larger and more complicated picture starts to emerge, a picture that reveals why this war is not just another headline in the news cycle. It may be one of the defining geopolitical events of our time, but the path that led here did not begin yesterday, it began years ago, and understanding that story changes everything. Because once you see how all the pieces fit together, you start to realize why the outcome of this war could shape the world for an entire generation. So before we explore what might happen next, we need to go back to the beginning, to the tensions, alliances, and turning points that quietly built the foundation for the crisis we are witnessing today. And when we do, the story becomes even more dramatic than most people imagine. To understand why this war matters so much today, we have to step back in time. Conflicts that shake the world rarely begin overnight. They are the result of years, sometimes decades, of growing tensions, shifting alliances, and strategic decisions made far away from the battlefield. In many ways, the story begins at the end of the Cold War, when the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991. The global balance of power changed dramatically. For the first time in nearly half a century, the world was no longer divided between two competing superpowers. Instead, a new era emerged, an era where one nation held unprecedented influence over global politics, military alliances, and economic institutions. For a time, it seemed as though the world was entering a period of relative stability, but beneath the surface, new rivalries were slowly taking shape. Countries that once operated within rigid Cold War blocs began redefining their positions. Some sought closer partnerships with Western powers. Others began rebuilding their own strength, determined to reclaim influence they believed had been lost. And as the decades passed, the geopolitical landscape grew more complicated. One of the most important factors was the expansion of military alliances. What began as a defensive arrangement during the Cold War gradually extended its reach further east, incorporating new members and shifting the strategic balance in regions that had once been neutral or contested. For some nations, this expansion represented security and protection. For others, it felt like encroachment, and that perception would become one of the most important drivers of future tensions. At the same time, another major transformation was taking place: the rise of new economic powers. Countries that had once been considered developing economies began growing at remarkable speed. Their industries expanded, their technological capabilities advanced, and their influence on global markets steadily increased. This shift created both opportunity and competition. On one hand, globalization connected economies in ways that had never existed before. Trade networks spread across continents, supply chains linked factories and markets around the world, and international cooperation seemed essential for prosperity. But on the other hand, competition for influence intensified. Control over energy resources, access to critical trade routes, technological dominance, strategic influence over key regions. All of these factors slowly began shaping the geopolitical tensions we see today. Then came another turning point. A series of regional crises and military confrontations signaled the world was moving into a more unstable era. Some conflicts remained limited in scope, others revealed deeper fractures between major powers. Sanctions were imposed, diplomatic relations deteriorated, military buildups accelerated, trust between rival governments eroded. But perhaps the most dangerous development was not a single event, it was a pattern where geopolitical competition increasingly replaced cooperation. As rival powers strengthened their militaries and reinforced their alliances, the international system began shifting away from the relatively stable order that had defined the early post-Cold War years. The world was becoming more fragmented, more competitive, more unpredictable. And then the crisis that sparked the current war finally erupted. The immediate triggers were complex territorial disputes, security concerns, and political decisions that pushed tensions past the breaking point. What had been years of diplomatic strain suddenly turned into open confrontation. Sanctions were announced, military deployments expanded, alliances began mobilizing resources and strategic support. Within days, the conflict became one of the most closely watched geopolitical events of the decade. But what makes this war different is not just the fighting itself. It is the number of powerful nations whose interests are tied to its outcome. Some are directly involved, others provide support, resources, or strategic backing. And this is where the situation becomes far more dangerous. Because history shows us something important. When powerful nations become deeply invested in the outcome of a war, the conflict rarely stays small. It begins to shape global alliances, affects international trade, influences military strategies around the world, and slowly, the consequences spread far beyond the original battlefield. Today, that process may already be underway. Governments are reassessing security strategies, defense budgets are increasing across multiple regions, new alliances are forming while old partnerships are tested. The geopolitical chessboard is shifting, but perhaps the most critical question is this: where does this path lead? Because every war eventually reaches a moment where its future becomes uncertain. Will diplomacy bring the conflict to an end? Will one side achieve a decisive advantage? Or will the war drag on, reshaping the international system in ways no one fully expects? Every war eventually reaches a crossroads, a moment where the direction of history could move down very different paths. Right now, analysts, military strategists, and political leaders across the world are asking the same urgent question: how does this war end? The outcome will not just determine who wins or loses on the battlefield. It could reshape global power for decades. Three major scenarios appear again and again. The first is the best-case scenario. Diplomacy pulls the combatants back to the negotiating table. International mediators step in. Economic pressure grows. Both sides realize continuing the fight costs more than compromise. Ceasefire. Peace talks. Front lines freeze. Large-scale fighting gradually ends. The world breathes a sigh of relief. Energy markets stabilize. Trade routes reopen. Economies recover. But trust remains damaged. Military spending continues. Divisions linger. The second is the moderate scenario. The war drags on. Front lines shift slowly. Battles flare. Diplomacy stalls. Alliances take sides. One receives weapons and intelligence. The other strengthens its partners. The conflict turns into a war of endurance. Energy prices remain unstable. Defense budgets swell. Nations prepare for a world where rivalry, not cooperation, is the new normal. The third is the worst-case scenario. The conflict spreads beyond its current boundaries. A single miscalculation, an accidental confrontation, or one step over an invisible line could draw more nations directly into the fight. Military alliances activate mutual defense obligations. Powerful nations with advanced weapons face off. Escalation could be catastrophic and unpredictable. Modern wars are like walking a tightrope, balancing deterrence, military pressure, and diplomacy simultaneously. And global interconnectedness amplifies risk. Financial markets react instantly. Energy supplies cross continents. Food and goods rely on fragile supply chains. Disruption in one region can ripple across the globe. The outcome won't just touch soldiers and leaders. It touches everyday people. Rising fuel prices, inflation, economic uncertainty. How the world responds now can shape the conflict itself. Because wars don't just destroy, they reshape the world. Wars are often measured in territory gained or lost, battles won or lost, but the true impact rarely stays on the battlefield. Ripple effects spread through economies, alliances, and societies. Even a limited conflict sends shockwaves. Energy prices spike. Shipping lanes face new risks. Companies scramble for alternatives. Grocery prices rise. Fuel costs climb. Monthly bills grow. Millions may never see the front lines, but they feel the consequences. Wars also reshape alliances. Governments face tough choices. Strengthen old partnerships. Form new alliances. Protect strategic interests. Over time, these choices permanently alter global power. Defense agreements expand. Regions shift politically. New partnerships emerge. Military innovation accelerates. Drones, cyber warfare, AI and defense planning, missile systems. Nations observe, adapt, and reshape their doctrines. Lessons learned can influence strategies for decades. Ordinary people, far from the battlefield, are affected. Food prices rise. Economies struggle. Global cooperation on climate, aid, or development becomes harder. Major wars rewrite the rules of the international system. After WWI, new institutions were created. Alliances formed. Power balances shifted. Today, some experts believe we may be witnessing another transformation. A world with different alliances, different economic centers, and different geopolitical priorities. Every war eventually ends. But history teaches us this: the real transformation begins after the fighting stops. The outcome doesn't just decide who wins. It decides what kind of world emerges afterward. This war could shape the global system for an entire generation. Power may shift. Alliances may be redefined. Economic globalization may fragment. Technological competition could intensify. And millions of lives will be affected, families displaced, communities rebuilding, young generations growing up under these choices. Time and again, humanity has faced moments when the future seemed uncertain, even dangerous. Yet those moments became opportunities to reshape the international system. Now, the question is, will the world learn from history or repeat its mistakes? The choices leaders make today, diplomatic decisions, economic strategies, military calculations, will echo for decades, long after the headlines fade, long after the war ends. Historians may look back and say this period marked the beginning of a new chapter in world history. A chapter where the balance of power shifted, alliances were redefined, the future of the global order was quietly decided. The outcome of this war will not just determine who wins. It may determine what kind of world the next generation inherits. And that is why the entire world is watching, because sometimes the events unfolding today become the history that shapes tomorrow.